Hi, and welcome to VIBEZ Daily. This is a daily devotional curated by VIBEZ Church to help you practice the way of Jesus and be all that God has called you to be. You have joined us for our year-long series titled Devoted. Acts 2:42 tells us that the followers of Jesus were devoted to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to breaking of bread, and to prayer. This podcast was created to provide context and commentary for what you read each day. Just before our friends begin discussing today's reading, we want to invite you not only for fellowship, but for prayer as well. We have created the VIBE Daily Chat Group to offer you fellowship and a community where you can state your observations, ask questions about the reading or the podcast. You can join us by downloading the VIBEZ Church app in your favorite app store. Click Join the Conversation and join us today. And finally, we hope that you can join us for prayer. Prayer happens Monday through Friday, and more information on that can be found on the VIBEZ Church app under prayer. Now, let's begin our conversation on today's reading.
All right, welcome back to the VIBEZ Daily Podcast, day 39 of the Devoted series. I am back with my wife, Victoria, my friend Shameeka. We're just excited really just to be here and continue our journey through Leviticus, almost through. We have one more day of reading and we'll be done with the entire book of Leviticus in 1 week, which is quite an accomplishment there. But we left off really with kind of God distinguishing the difference between clean and unclean. And here today, he's kind of going to distinguish between righteous and unrighteous and holy and unholy, right? And kind of do that here as we pick up on chapter 17. And so as we get to chapter 17, he really kind of starts with kind of what we can't do, right? What are some things that are forbidden, those things that probably were practices for the people of Israel before, or maybe things that they had witnessed in some of these other lands, and really trying to help clarify what they should not do. What jumped out to you guys here in chapter 17? First kind of dealing with some sacrifices, but ultimately the 17 and 18 as we kind of go through some of those things we shouldn't do. Anything that jumped out to you guys?
Verse 11 did for me because I feel like it just kind of summed it all up as to like why this blood thing was a really big deal. And verse 11 says like, for the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have given it to you to make atonement for yourselves on the altar. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life. And so I just felt like that just really like brought to light why, like that guy was making this big deal about the blood, but then I'm like immediately like, oh, this Jesus.
Yeah.
Like it's the blood that makes atonement for one's life, and knowing that he was and is that sacrificial lamb that gave his blood for us. Like he made an atonement for us, for our life. Yeah. So that was something that stuck out to me.
Yeah, I think it's good. It's one of the things that I tend to look at kind of how we do church sometimes from like a third party observer, and one of the things I think is if I didn't know Jesus at all and I didn't know anything about the church and I came in and walked in and heard y'all talking about the blood all the time, I feel like y'all was crazy, y'all was weird, right? But I think that is, I love, as you said, that just summary of the importance that even from a pagan perspective, even not even spiritually, but just in the natural, that like the blood is essential to life. Like it literally is what keeps our life going, our bodies going, our brains, everything is based off of the blood in our bodies, right? Like without it, we are nothing. There's a lot of organs we could live without of. There's a lot of bones we could live without of, muscles, nerves. There's a lot of things that we could still have life even without, but like the blood is essential to that. And I think it's great to hear that explanation, because I think as we even deal with, is it Jesus, and if you were to kind of even talk to someone who may not believe, that you kind of just understand like there's a significance in blood, and that was the purpose. And again, not for us to drink or eat, we're not some weird cult thing where we're like drinking blood every week, but it's like there's a significance in it to our lives and ultimately to the sacrifice that Jesus makes. So I think it's interesting that you pointed that out, because I think it's definitely good to have that explanation.
Well, like it's teaching us to like honor and respect what God's created, and like why he created it, and like the how important these things are, to not
Yeah.
just take these things for granted and do what you want with them.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think what stuck out to me was this like first section where he's telling them that they can't take like their sacrifices and kill them in the open field, or not, that they have to bring them to like the tent of meeting and bring them to the priest, like to offer their sacrifices. And in verse 7 explains it, so they will no more sacrifice their sacrifices to goat demons or whoever they whore. And I was just like, oh yeah, like there needs to be accountability here. Like like without community, you could get lost
Yeah.
into sacrificing to whoever you want to sacrifice. And, but make sure that if you see anybody making a sacrifice, that you see them taking it to the temple, like
That's good.
for accountability purpose. Like all these sacrifices are going to the Lord. Like don't get comfortable thinking that you can sacrifice at your house or in your own field or wherever.
Yeah.
That's really good. And even my mine's going further to say that the goat idols are demons.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, come on, like let's just say it plain and day, like call it for what it is, because this is real life. And I think even today this is applicable, because you do see certain religions or even different things that the world kind of clings on to, is like they're sacrificing these things and not knowing that, oh, you're actually sacrificing it to a demon. And some of them do know.
Yeah.
But to know that like God pointed that out, that was really good.
Yeah.
And how there's still order that he's requiring for how we present things to him.
Yeah. I mean, it's clear, whether we go back to 10 Commandments or even to this point, all the way up to this point, like God doesn't have room for anything else.
Yeah.
Like he just doesn't. He has no tolerance, no patience, no room for any other idol, God, whatever practice. And I think that it is still very important to us today. Like, yes, I may not be bowing to a goat myself, right, or whatever, but like, man, there could still be things that I idolize or that I've placed on a pedestal or in a relevant way that, like, to God, that he just doesn't have room for. He is not in the business of competing with anybody else. Like, he's a jealous God. Like, he is not in the business of finding ways to make room. He is like, it's just me and me alone. And it'd be clear there. So yeah, I think that's good. I do love, again, just this repetition of God trying to clarify and establish who his people are, how they act and behave, what makes them different, right? So, like you said, whether it's these goat demons, whether it's the eating of blood, whether it's some of the other pagan practices that we'll get to about like their sexuality and things that they're doing, that like across the board, it's just like, let me just help establish you ought to be different than the others around you. And I'm really trying to set you apart and make you different. So I love just seeing that again, that he's just really trying to establish y'all need to be in your own lane, to be set apart and be different, and this is how you act, and this is what that looks like, to reflect that.
And I feel like he lays that out in the beginning of chapter 18, like right here.
Yep.
And this is, I'm sure, what you were speaking to, right? That like he's just like, speak to the people of Israel, and say to them like, I am the Lord your God. Like, do not do as they do in the land of Egypt where you used to live. Or do not do as they did in the land of Canaan, which I'm about to bring you. Which was to your point, Shameeka, the other day, right? And it's like, you should not walk in their statutes. You should follow my rules and keep my statutes and walk in them, for I am the Lord your God. And so I think it is like, once again, don't do what you used to do. Don't do what you about to go see. I am your God. I gave you all of these rules. And it's like a parent. I'm like, okay, listen here, kids. I'm your mama. Okay? When we go here,
and don't ask
these are the rules, okay? Don't leave without anybody. Don't take anything from anybody. Like, I have all these rules, right? Like, and if you need something, you come to me. Right? Like, don't I'll be right there.
Right.
And so it seems like these like parental ground rules, like, okay, before we go in this store, these are the
Don't
rules.
ask for nothing.
Yeah.
Don't do what these kids is doing. Don't
Yeah,
act up. I don't care what they're doing.
Yeah. I also thought it was so cool because it's bringing up the land of Canaan, where he's bringing them to, how this land was a wicked land before, and how God decided to choose a people to be the one to kind of atone it, or to kind of like, not atone per se, but kind of cleanse it, because what was once wicked and bad, like he's using a people in a generation to make it good, again, to make it holy, to clean it. And I think about it, even like when in our own lives, like some of us when we move into a new house, or even in our own house, where we want to like refresh the place, or like we want to like, let me go ahead and like, get my oil and like pray over it and all that stuff. Like he has these people again learning what it looks like to be holy, so that when you go into this land, you've covered it. Everything is pure and back to what it originally is supposed to be. But I appreciate chapter 18 because I feel like God really showed himself to be a God of order. That what was once done before, or what was once okay, like he's like no longer. Like the whole incest, the stuff that what was okay in the previous generations, like this is where we see him really when it comes to sexuality, sexual relations specifically. He's nipping it in the bud now. And whereas before it was used to extend lineages, it was used because if like we saw in the previous chapters, like, okay, the brother, he didn't get to have a child before he died. Now he would take the other brother responsibility would be to take the wife. He's like, no, not anymore. Like we're not doing this anymore. And I wonder if that spoke to just how God had made them increase so much in number that now we don't need to do all of that. We're already great in number, and we've populated the earth, so to speak, that like now the whole incest and all that stuff isn't what's needed to populate and to come about the Israelite, make the Israelites. So
That's really good. It is, because I thought about the same thing when it was looking at like not having relations with like your sister, whether it's your father's or your mother's like daughter. I was like, well, didn't Abraham?
That's Sarah, right? That was Sarah and Abraham.
I was like, Abraham and Sarah.
That would disqualified them. Yep.
Yeah, and so he said, I think he said there's a different order now that it is now, like even for like the priests that we'll get to, is like, okay, marry within the tribe of Israel.
Yeah.
But like you said, y'all got many options now. Like, y'all got many options. Like you don't have to go out. You don't have to go in your immediate family, and you also don't have to go outside of the Israelites.
Yeah. And to your point, I mean, even back to when you talk about Abraham and Sarah, like again, they are coming from a pagan lifestyle, right?
Yep.
So, even they're actually already married before God even speaks to Abram at that point, right? Like he already has Sarai as a wife at that point. And so it does speak that, like, yes, it's very much these were the practices of the people before then, which is why, as you guys mentioned, verse 3 is so important, because he's like, whatever practice, forget everything you knew before, and don't embrace where you about to go. Like, there's a very clear structure and very clear standard that I'm going to hold you to. And even speaking of Abraham, I mean, verse 21, right? This is kind of what we referred to way back when we were talking about Abraham and Isaac specifically, right? Because he tells us, don't sacrifice any of your children in fire to Molech.
Yes.
Do not profane the name of your God. I am the Lord, right? Like, it's clear that they had this experience that Molech required a sacrifice of their children, right? And so, like, even in the way that that's written, it's just like, now we go back and go, oh, I get it now. I mean, we talked about it then, but like, oh, I get why Abraham didn't think twice to take Isaac to sacrifice his son. That's why he got up so early. It wasn't asking that much of him, because for them and their practices, it was understood that this was something that was regular to do. And so, I love that he was like very clear, like, no, don't do this, don't do that. don't do these things.
Yeah, which is so interesting because I did notice that, like, he said, and I love the Lord because he was so detailed. He specifically pointed out Egypt and Canaan. And Canaan was exactly where Abraham lived, right? Yeah. Like, that was where he dwelled at. And so he said you got all these, like, connections making, like, in Canaan, they served Molech, which Abraham was not, probably knew the customs, right? And so...
And isn't that the same place where he was telling them, like, don't go and have wives at and stuff at some point? Like, God knew what was happening there. And even in verse 28, it further says, like, you know, well, before that, it was saying, like, these things were done, you know, before you guys in these lands that defiled them. And if you defile the land, it will vomit you out as it vomited out the nations before you. Like, God is making it clear that, again, I'm trying to make reparations. Like, I'm trying to, you know, I said I was going to do the flood again, but, like, if you continue to do these things, like, there's going to be consequences of it.
Yeah. And I love how he's... Oh, I'm sorry. I love when he's just like, in verse 24, like, all these nations I'm driving out before you. Yep. Like, and they're... Because they're unclean. And I do think it was, like, interesting. He said, and they made the land unclean. Like you said, they defiled the land. I'm like, wow, like... That's still part of his creation, like living and breathing, right? That, like, somehow this land is being able to be defiled too. Yeah. But I do love that he is, as we see later on in the Bible, that, like, he stays true to his word. Like, you can act like them if you want to. Yeah. But just like I kicked them out, you gonna get kicked out too of that land. Like, I'm not gonna bring you in this place to run amok, right? And so. I don't know. Once again, I just have this parent-child thing. Like, I'm gonna give you this. Yeah. But if you start cutting up, I'm about to take it away.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, actually, verse 24 is exactly where I was gonna go as well. But also just for the foreshadowing of it, like, you know, I think may have mentioned this kind of in our conversations previously, but this is a crucial verse for what ultimately happens in Joshua, right? Because when we get to Joshua and God tells Joshua and the people of Israel to kill everybody. Yeah. Jeez, and in Canaan. And that could be a hard thing to wrestle with. God, like, just trying to literally genocide a people. And I mean, like, women, children, everybody. But verse 24 of 18 gives us the why. Yes. Right? He's like, listen, I'm going to drive out because they have defiled themselves by all of these things. All this stuff that we just read, I told you not to do, they're doing all that. Yeah. They sacrificing children. They sleeping with their sisters and brothers and mamas and daddies and animals. Like, they're doing all this stuff. They're eating stuff that's unclean and drinking blood. They're doing all this stuff I just told you. Yeah. And they've gotten so sinful that I have to redeem the land. They have defiled the land they even live on. And so it gives us this clarity that, like, this is judgment. Yeah. By the time Joshua comes around, this is judgment on the people of Canaan. Yeah. And again, we may say, well, that's unfair, but God has shown a lot of grace to this point, right? We know Canaan has been around for a while because Abram was there. Yeah. You know, so there's been a lot of grace to this point. But ultimately, this is a huge verse and a foreshadowing of, like, why God does what he does. Because, again, as difficult as it may be to hear him say, kill everybody, it's like, this is why. Because they are so defiant and so defiled at this point.
Yeah. And just like, you know, you continue to see these things carry out and continue on in generations despite God's, like, command. It just goes to show, like, there's nothing new under the sun. Like, even to this day, there's still things that in these laws, and he was like, you know, having sex with animals, you'll see headlines and stories saying about the same thing.
YouTube videos.
Yep, YouTube, all of that. So, yeah, it's really sad.
Don't search that. Please don't. I'm sorry, y'all. My bad.
It's ridiculous. But yeah. Okay, so chapter 19. Lord speaks to Moses again. And again, what's the phrase you guys keep kind of bringing up to us that he says, be holy because I am holy, right? So he kind of gives us that again. And he starts to give us some instructions in 19 about, again, how to be holy and what that looks like. What jumps out to you guys in chapter 19?
It was the heading one of my headings right before verse 9 says, love your neighbor as yourself. And then it goes into like all these laws. Like it this whole chapter to me just, it feels like a reiteration of the 10 Commandments, right? Like he starts off in verse 2 and 3 talking about honor your mother and your father, keep my Sabbaths, don't turn to idols. And then he goes into, like you said, once again, these don't steal. Like, how do we interact with each other? And I think he said, I think it's just another layer of instructions with a little bit more detail this time, because even after he's saying some of these things, like he's introducing, again, okay, remember that sacrifice of peace offering that I told you about? Okay, let's talk about that again in this context. And so,
well, that's really good that you pointed that out. I did see how, one, I thought it was interesting that this is the first time I'm seeing God say, like, don't make different kinds of animals. Like him really, did you notice that too? Like, he's like, don't create these mixed breeds and stuff. And I wonder if that has anything to do with, again, in certain instances, you could kind of think of this as like people trying to take ownership and be their own God and like create something that God didn't even create. So I wonder if that was the reason why that was brought up. But yeah, you see a lot of stuff like him having to bring up like, don't turn to mediums or spiritists, like don't, dibble and dabble into the divination. And this is the first time I've seen, plain as day, verse 28, it says, don't put tattoo marks on yourselves. And I'm like, ooh. But yeah, I thought a lot of this was definitely interesting. And I just felt like when I was reading verses 23 through 25, I'm like, I just see this resemblance of Eden. Like God kind of like talking about this forbidden fruit, if you will. Like I'm seeing that same kind of trace of what Eden was, for him to say, like, when you enter the land and plant any kind of fruit tree, regard its fruit as forbidden, and then for 3 years you are to consider it forbidden, and there's a whole thing that's associated with it. And as a result of them listening to God, like he'll make a harvest and make an increase. But yeah, there was a bunch of little things that in this chapter that really stuck out.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was interesting to me. That was kind of like, I have to maybe like reconsecrate the land again, like that you guys are coming into. But I love that in the fourth year, it was once again setting the tone that you give God his first.
Yes.
And then in the 5th year, like, then you may eat of it. And like the Lord's going to bring you increase in that. And so I do think that, like, I think I would be eager. I planted this thing. I'm watching this thing grow for the last 3 years. It's like, now it's time to eat. Come on, we hungry. Like, but he's like, no. The 4th year, this is mine. And once again, that self-denial that he has them learning and practicing. Like, it's not about what you want, because it also reminds me of when the Israelites were in the wilderness and he had given them quail. And like they were so eager to like get into the quail that they didn't even like cook it or boil it. They was like eating it with the flesh and all that. And like the Lord's anger just burned down on them because he's like, you have no self-control.
Yes.
Like, I'm giving you these things. Have some self-control. Like, honor me. Like, do these things in the way that I've asked you to do them.
And even when, like you said, when he was giving them the manna, and then he told them the Sabbath, and they're like, no, I'm trying to go out there and try to see if I can get some more. Just in case. I think it does, like, there is probably a significance to just 1 year alone. That is a long time. That is a long time to, like, you see it's in front of you. Like, you can see, it's bearing fruit now, and would that look good, that temptation? But yet, like, no, there's a time where you will be able to enjoy it, but right now, like, no, this is mine.
I thought something else I think is interesting, and it's not all just kind of in this section, but you mentioned kind of the not crossbreeding of animals. There's others in Leviticus where we get to like not wearing threads, like mixing threads, and like, you know, some other things that I think there's a couple things that jump out to me about it. Is one, the word holy itself means set apart, right? I think there is this, you know, as we've talked about clean and unclean and holy and holy, like I think even in the way that they breed animals and with the clothes that wear, that there was this clear, like, distinguished look, right? That things were separate. And that was holy. It was holy to be separate and to be set apart. And that's why they didn't want things to be crossbred. And the second thought of that to me was, I think God almost also made it such that their holiness was like apparent. Like it was outwardly apparent as well.
Yeah.
Right? Where like if someone from a different country or culture or land came by, like the people look different, right? They don't have tattoos, their hair is not cut, their threads are, you know, in linens, then mixed fabrics, and you know, their animals, like it was like they looked different, right?
Yeah,
they looked, and it was just obvious to people that, okay, they are the people of God, or they're different. There's something set apart. And I think, again, there's just something we can take from that. Like, is it that apparent that we belong to Jesus? You know, like, can people look at us and just see that there's something different and something set apart? Because for them, they were. And now, granted, yeah, they misunderstood that too at some point, right? Like, they got too caught up in how the holiness apparent and appearance that they just forgot that it was also about their heart. But I think it's still something to be pointed out that God was establishing these laws that made it where from the outside it was clear that they were set apart and they were different.
Yes.
I think that's so interesting. I was thinking about this as you were talking, that God now has like elevated them to this like holy like level, and like it has them like separated from people around them. And I can tell that over the years, it kind of probably like felt haughty about this and like pompous, right? Like, oh no, we're set up. We don't touch that. We don't eat that. Like, oh, I can't come near you. Like, I can't. We're God's chosen people, right?
Right.
But I think it's really interesting that when I thought about how the Egyptians viewed Jacob and his family when they came, like they didn't even sit at the table or couldn't even sit at the table because, like, you know, they were saying that the Israelites were detestable to the Egyptians. So at one point, like, they were the detestable ones.
Yeah.
Like, they were the ones who were looking like, oh no, we can't live with you. We can't eat with you. We can't dwell with you. Like, go ahead and live in Goshen because shepherds are detestable to us, you know? Until now, just to see that, like, they're the ones who are now being elevated as holy and righteous, like, through these different things, is just like, oh wow, like how the Lord can like turn things around.
Yes. But also still be concerned about their hearts, because you do see even in these various laws, like he talks about just having being fair in what you do, like when it comes to like justice and stuff, like how to handle things, when it comes to your neighbors, how to handle certain things, even when it comes to not being dishonest about how you measure certain things. Like he's still like, let me come for that heart. Like make sure you aren't doing things. And even I don't know if we spoke about it yet or if it's in the later chapters, when it comes to like even slavery and stuff, like don't be mistreating people and being, you know, all like harsh and stuff with them, and like because you were slaves yourself and you knew how it felt to be in those positions. So I love that God is establishing that and showing that. And then for some reason, verse 35, when it did talk about the different measuring of and weighing of things, immediately I was reminded of like the tax collectors and like how like there was deceit and stuff that we'll see later on of just these laws and these, you know, weighing of things that ultimately, you know, they weren't being honest, but God already establishing this even now.
And there's so many things just keep getting repeated over and over and over. Like the guy's like reiterating, like there's no interpreting omens or fortune tellers and these mediums and stuff. Like he's mentioned that like 2-3 times before, but then going into chapter 20, he once again is talking about like don't turn to any mediums, because now it's like the consequences here. Like now if you turn to the if you go to these mediums, then I will set my face against that person, cut him off among the people. Like, now it's like, don't do these things. And if you do, like, here are the consequences.
Yeah.
But even also, like, this sacrificing of children to Molech. Like, we've seen it a few times, but here it comes up again. And I feel like he's like, at this point, there's no excuses. Like, like the fact that he's like, you need to stone this person, and I will set my face against them. And he says, like, the people who sacrifice their children to Molech, like, they make his sanctuary unclean, and they profane his holy name. And I'm like, oh, I haven't heard that one before. Like, this whole profaning my name, like, he is really serious about not sacrificing these children. Like, you can tell, which is so funny. Like you said, like, when it comes to the Abraham thing, like, nah, that isn't his heart. He is so not playing about sacrificing these children. Because he knew all along he wasn't going to have him do that. Like, that's not his heart. But yeah, you see this repetition of don't do this, and now we see like all these consequences that will come with it now.
Yeah, and a lot of them being death. Like, he's straight up saying, like, all right, you having relations with certain people, you're doing this, you're doing that, like, you're to be put to death. And even how I thought this was interesting when it talked about the sexual relations with like an aunt or you know, marrying your brother's wife, how they will be childless. And again, the whole reason to do this before was so that you could continue to lineage, and to have a son. And to like, but now God is like, oh, if you do this, you won't even be able to bear like children.
Because like at this point, you're just doing this for yourself and your own pleasure. Like, you know, but yeah, I think it's so serious because even some of these consequences of these relations is like they should be burned with fire. I was like, oh, it's getting real. Like, it's not just send them outside the camp. Like you said, it's like, it's death. Like, kill the woman and the animal. Kill this person. Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah.
All right, so we kind of conclude 20 and head into 21 here, and really kind of go again more instructions kind of for the priest, right? Kind of what we have here. Anything in 21 that you guys thought was interesting before we wrap up today's conversation?
Yeah, I did like how again God is establishing these different like things for the rules for the priests and what sets them apart, but he was very detailed as to now like who they should marry, like the type of women, like it has to be a virgin. So we're seeing like this cleanness and this purity that he even wants with their brides. But even when it came to something that stuck out to me in verse 9, like the priest's daughter, like if she defiles herself by becoming a prostitute, she disgraces her father and must be burned in the fire. And that was something that was really big that stuck out, because God, it shows that God, there is a weight as the priest's sons and daughters to like what you do, like not only represents God, but it represents your father, the priest. And whenever you do that, you do defile and disgrace them in that way. And so, yeah, again, we're seeing these things like be put to death as a result of something. But yeah, those are some of the things that stuck out to me.
Yeah, PK kit problems.
Yes,
standards.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was looking at this not making themselves unclean for the dead among their people at like the very first verses. And it did remind me of when Eric was talking about the Good Samaritan, like that illustration, right? That like it says in that parable that like the man was beaten like almost to death. Like he probably looked dead. Yeah. Like he probably was not like, hey, help. Like he was probably out and just bloody and dead, looking. And so it was a rule, right? It was a rule for them to like not make themselves unclean for your family members, let alone some random man on the side of the road. Which kind of brings more light to why the Levite and the priest just passed on over, because like this is against the rules. But then to your point though, like it shouldn't keep us from loving those, right? And loving others. And so even as a priest, like it's so funny because in that parable we always think, well, they should be the first ones to help. Like but it is like, okay, Lord, what do you have for me? Like, what do you want from me in this moment, right? And we just come out of these chapters talking about love and how to conduct ourselves with each other.
Yeah.
And so I think it's interesting that that was like the first thing that was mentioned as one of their rules.
Yeah.
In this section. So yeah, that was really interesting to me. The other thing was later on, it's talking about like the types of men who have blemishes and how they're not able to act as priests or assume that role, or even come to the temple if they have these like blemishes and stuff. And
Verse
I think
18.
I think it's really interesting. I'm like, okay, Lord, but like, weren't you the creator of them? Like, didn't you create them possibly with that blemish or that deformity, or one limb being longer than the other? Like, they don't have control over that. And so I thought that was interesting again, but maybe like we mentioned before, like a result of sin just in this world in general. And still making a delineation between holy and unholy. Like, it could be just for the sake of making sure we still realize that, like, there's a delineation between what is holy and what's unholy.
Right.
Yeah.
Sin or not sin.
Yeah. I mean, I think it reflects the same thing for the animals, right? That he requires as a sacrifice. Like, they couldn't have a blemish or a deformity or anything of that nature as well. And so, yeah, I think that, to your point, and again, it's maybe hard for us to hear. Because, we want a God that just loves us for who we are, and he does, right? Like, let's just be clear, he still loves us. But yeah, God is holy. And it just, it's his nature, it's who he is, and he cannot change that about himself either, right? And so his standards and his expectations and what is required to be in his presence, like, can't change either.
Yeah.
And I don't know, there's a part of me that, like, as much as, like, yeah, that may sadden me in some ways, right? For, like, I feel for these people who I feel like this wasn't their fault. There's also, like, a part of me that I appreciate that we have a holy God.
Yeah.
Because, like that's worth serving to me. Like, he's worth worshiping and worth serving and worth honoring, because I know it really is who he is. Like, he is holy and righteous and set apart and different. And, like, I'd have a tough time if he was just another man like the rest of us, right? And knowing that he had imperfections and whatnot, it'd be a lot harder to understand or to want to choose to submit to him. But, like, no, the fact that he is holy and he can't change that about himself, in some ways it's comforting. Like, I'm just glad to know that's the kind of God I serve. But yeah, it does. It just speaks to the fact that, again, he is holy. He can't change that about himself, despite, again, whatever reason or cause it may have been for that.
And being in his presence is a privilege, right? Like, we don't deserve that.
Yeah.
And so, like you say, it could be saddening, like, oh, they don't get to go. But, like, at the end of the day, none of us belong.
Yeah.
Like, none of us belong in his presence. And so I see, though, like you said, that he still cares for them, because he still allows them to eat of the bread and of the most holy things. Like, they just can't themselves go behind the veil, but the Lord's still like, you can still eat and participate and partake in this communion with me, just not behind the veil. Right?
Yeah. And it's particularly speaking to Aaron's descendants. Like, these are the people that God is like, they aren't to have those defects. But I think it also makes sure that it doesn't leave room for people to try to justify, and make up excuses or find that loophole, if you will, in law. Because, like you said, if this was a standard for animals, for them to not have defects, and we also see it with people, we don't get to kind of like try to make any justification. Whereas had he did allow it, we could have made reason for even other things and other laws to be like, well, what about in this case? Like, you ain't specifically say that, so let me test it out. So, yeah.
Kind of last thought I have here is, it's clear in verse 10 of 21. It says, "The priest who is the highest among his brothers, who has had the anointing oil poured on his head and has been ordained to wear the clothes, must not dishevel his hair or tear his clothes." It kind of goes to some other stuff, but it's clear that God also kind of elevated the standard for the priest than he had for the people, right? That his expectations for them were even greater because they had to be, these are the go-between people that actually go before God.
Yeah.
And I actually almost came away more challenged. We talk about how in the, new covenant that we live in today through Jesus Christ, that we no longer have to do a lot of what's here. But I think it's interesting that, one of the doctrine that we kind of believe in as Christians today is the priesthood of all believers, right? That all of us are priests now. We all have that access to God that these priests had. And so it's interesting when I think about the elevated expectation of the priest to think that actually that's really probably been extended to all of us as well. Sure. That elevated expectation of how we live and who we are and what's expected of us is really all of us now, and and there's no longer a delineation between the pastors and preachers and leaders and the people, but it's if we believe the priesthood of all believers, if all of us carry that, right? I think the passage you love going back to is that 2 Peter or 1 Peter 2, I think it is, that we are not just a holy people, we're a royal priesthood, right? That is who we are. Then I think that it almost carries that same expectation and weight that he gives to Aaron and his sons, that we carry that as well.
Yeah. That's good.
So, any other thoughts here from today's reading before we jump into our final day?
That's it. No.
All right. Well, look, we appreciate you guys again joining us today. One more day of reading for the book of Leviticus, so come back and see us tomorrow. Until then, take care.
Thank you for joining us for the VIBEZ Daily podcast. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, or download our favorite, the VIBEZ Church app. Visit vibes.church/devoted for additional episodes, notes, details, and the latest merch. Join us next time as we continue